Welcome to the Aspirant Network. Firstly, I would like to take a moment and thank all of you for your overwhelmingly positive response on the Polity Active Learning Course. Now, in this video, I wanted to talk to you about this newly added Polity Current Affairs module, this topic of current affairs. Before that, let's just take a brief moment and see how we generally study concepts for any subject in terms of its current affairs, in terms of its news. So, on the one hand, we have proper current affairs, right? On the other extreme end, we have what is called static. In between these is something that lives here called contemporary affairs. Now, contemporary is literally in the middle of CA and current affairs and static. Think about it this way. When the Aadhaar was created back in 2009 2010, तभी शुरू हो गया था. उस time पे it was proper current affairs. Then in around 2016, Aadhaar Act came and UIDAI became a statutory body. It started becoming contemporary. Since then, now Aadhaar is there and it is relevant since then for every single Indian person in terms of governance. कहीं ना कहीं काफी जगह आपको आपका आधार यूज करना पड़ता है. And conversations about Aadhaar are almost never ending. They're required in either some scheme, and then there's a debate as to why it's required, it shouldn't be required, or it's integrated somewhere where it is required and helpful. So right now, Aadhaar is turning into something of a static concept. Think about another example. Let's talk about Niti Aayog. When the Planning Commission was abolished and the Niti Aayog was created, back then, the Niti Aayog was a proper current affairs topic, right? But obviously, because it was replacing the Planning Commission as another kind of executive body, it became contemporary almost instantaneously. And almost instantaneously, it's also become a static concept. Because आपको Niti Aayog अलग से, you will have to study it. So that is why, for example, in our executive bodies, we study Niti Aayog as a complete separate subtopic. Another example here would be, if we talk about elections, the Special Intensive Revision, SIR, it's been in the news for so long and it impacts so many of us that it has transformed into something of a contemporary nature. And in this exam of UPSC, contemporary topics are very heavily asked in both prelims and mains, which is why if you're a part of the active learning course, you don't have much to worry about. Everything that is contemporary is already a part of your active learning module. So, for example, for SIR, everything you need to know will be here. It is here. You don't have to worry about it. आपको बस यही questions answer करने हैं. And if you can recall all of these things, you're absolutely sorted. You have nothing to worry about. However, we have recently also added within the polity module a specific space for current affairs. Now, the idea here is simple. We've made it month-wise. So, April to July is already here. August will, of course, be added after August is over, and we've compiled all of the news items that we could find through the Hindu, Indian Express, all the newspapers, PIB, and everything. And then we'll add August. However, what I want to specifically talk to you about right now for what we already have, that is April to July, whenever you come here, whenever you're studying here, first and foremost, these are items that you should preferably go through once you have at least gone through the entire module at least once. Or if you're a senior aspirant, you're a veteran, you've studied for polity before, and you're here more for comprehensiveness than pedagogy. In that case, you don't have to worry too much about missing out on a lot, because you will have the bare minimum context required to understand the questions that are there for your comprehensive coverage of your polity, okay, current affairs. Another thing here is, so for example, if you look at April, you can see the importance ratings that are given here. Now, for when we give these important ratings for static or for contemporary affairs ke matters, it is based on a very mathematical formula. And that is basically, number one, how many times has it been tested? Has it been asked? Right? This is your first and foremost thing. If that concept has been asked quite a few times, let's say twice or thrice in different ways, then it is very, very, very important. And this is for both prelims and mains. Secondly, if it is fundamental in understanding the entire topic or subtopic or the subject itself, then it becomes very important. So, for example, fundamental duties in the last 13 years of mains, not a single direct question has been asked. Of course, you can use it for value addition, and you absolutely must use it for value addition and for justifications everywhere in your mains answers. However, direct question तो नहीं आया है. It is still fundamental in understanding the constitution itself. हमारा कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन समझने के लिए इतना इंपॉर्टेंट है. डीपीएसपीस का भी सिमिलर सीन है. At max, there's been, I think, one question that has been asked that has been directly about the Uniform Civil Code. Yet, all the DPSPs are very important, even for mains, because they are fundamental in you understanding how the Constitution works, how our governance structure works, how our policy status works, which is why DPSP by itself is very important. Now, coming to current affairs, ये mathematical formula can't really work out here. The reason is very simple. The questions that are asked about current affairs, subject-wise, especially polity, firstly, you can divide and decide whether a question is from the current affairs section or a static based on your own methodology. So some people would say if something's inspired by current affairs but a static concept, उसको फिर भी current affairs में include करते हैं, थोड़े जगह नहीं करते. That doesn't matter. What matters here is mostly जो questions आए हैं जो direct current affairs के भी है, they are very wide. बहुत heavy breadth है इनका. Hence even our studying of this थोड़ा हमको breadth पे ध्यान देना है more so than depth. The depth required is given here. This is the depth that you have to go through. जैसे कि अगर impeachment of judges जैसे न्यूज में आया था in April, these are the questions that you need to answer, and that's it. This is the depth that you go through with regards to that current affairs item. Focus is always on breadth. You have to cover more things, specifically because questions are wide. Although some questions do go in a little bit of depth, that is why we've designed it to go into that level of depth यहाँ also. However, this brings us back to that importance rating. Because of this nature of current affairs, this rating becomes opinion based, right? And even though it's an expert based opinion, it cannot be taken at face value because nobody can predict which question UPSC decides is important and which question is not. So while you can rely on the importance ratings for the other parts to plan your revision for your current affairs section, I would highly recommend that you use the importance rating as a very vague marker. Not true for static. For static, that is your, also you can think about it as a revision priority order. So for example, 3s and 4s and 5s you should most definitely not have a problem with. 1s and 2s फिर भी चल जाएगा if you're not very comfortable with. Not true for current affairs. The other thing here. So when you're going through this, whenever you're reading about rights, they're very, very important. If you're reading about, let's say, something like legislations that have been announced or legislations that have been in the news, for example, this one or the FCRA amendment, all of this becomes very important either way. Because if a question is to come based on an act or a legislation, it is highly likely that that is based on only two things. One is if it's in the current affairs. So if it's in the current affairs, it is important. Other than that, generally, you have this. It will be basically to implement either fundamental rights. So the laws that you've been given here, and it's maybe again the depth that you go into is the question that are asked here. Going beyond that is not required because you have a paucity of time. You have to be very precise. So apart from the acts and legislations that implement the fundamental rights, another similar one are the acts that implement your DPSPs. So for example, the employment guarantee legislations or the maternity benefit act or the wage legislations, the Legal Services Authority Act of 1987. These things remain important. And this is how you decide which acts you're supposed to read more about. So you're never confused if a question is asked. The other thing that you should do is when you're going through things like this, if there is ever data based current affairs, always understand that data based, especially for polity, is relatively rare in prelims. Not that questions नहीं आते हैं, कम आते हैं बस. ज़्यादातर, even when they're asked, they're tied to a specific, you could say, scheme or an act or something like that. Which, but for mains, यहाँ पे you have to often justify your opinion, because when an opinion is asked, as an aspiring civil servant, the opinion that you form, the opinion that you argue for, cannot be random. It cannot be prejudicial. It cannot be based on your whims and fancies. It has to be based on facts, or if not on facts, on either on data or on expert opinion. And when I say expert here, I mean, so for example, jurists for constitutional opinions. Imagine or think about the opinions of either former or present judges of the Supreme Courts and High Courts, of the Supreme Court and the High Courts. And apart from that, of course, if you have any other well-known personality who's a well-known academician or a thought leader, you can always quote them as well. Other than that, there is data. So if you're saying that our justice system is slow, in the current affairs, there would have been something or the other about that. Somebody would have done the research and they would have said that so and so cases are pending in so and so kinds of courts, which points to the possibility that our justice system may actually be slow. When you write it that way, while quoting the data and its source, your opinion is now justified. You formed it on a well reasoned thought. If you directly write, our justice system is slow and this is what we need to do to change it, you're just speaking out of or without any backing. You're speaking from an opinionated place that is not grounded in data, and that is problematic. So for that, also look at current affairs that ask that. So for example, your prison statistics India 2024, something like this. This is from the current affairs of May. ये चीजें, if you can answer, if you can recall based on these questions, then you can finally quote them in your answers as well, and then you have a very well formed opinion. So this is how you're supposed to use this current affairs module. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day and happy learning.